The wind cut sharp across the barren stretch of Wyoming plain, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. She had nowhere left to go, no family to call, and nothing but a suitcase with worn clothes and a heart heavy from the weight of too many goodbyes. When the ranch appeared on the horizon, smoke curling from the chimney and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, it felt less like a place and more like salvation. She hadn't planned on stopping, but desperation has a way of making choices for you. He found her sitting on the fence rail, boots caked with dust, eyes hollow but unflinching. The cowboy had seen that look before, of someone holding on by a thread, someone who didn't know if tomorrow would meet them with kindness or cruelty. Without asking too many questions, he handed her a pair of gloves and told her she could start by mucking stalls. It wasn't much, but it was a job, and for her, it was life. Days stretched into weeks. She rose before the sun, fed horses, hauled hay, and learned the rhythm of a land that demanded respect but gave back a strange kind of peace. Slowly, her silence gave way to laughter, small at first, then freer, carried across the open fields. He noticed it every time, though he never let on. Cowboys weren't men of many words, but they felt deeply in ways they rarely admitted. One evening, after branding season had left them both bone-tired, he leaned on the corral fence beside her. The air was cool, stars spilling across the sky like spilled salt. She told him she was grateful for the work, for the roof, for the second chance. That's when he turned to her, eyes steady as the horizon. "I'd pay double," he said, voice rough with sincerity, "if you'd stay forever." The words landed heavier than any wage could measure. For the first time in a long time, she realized survival wasn't all she wanted. She wanted belonging, and maybe, just maybe, she had finally found it. The days on the ranch settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she craved. Morning began with the rooster's crow, the cold bite of the air against her skin, and the smell of coffee wafting from the main house. She wasn't used to this kind of life, the kind that demanded grit and strength with no promise of praise, but there was something grounding about it. Each chore was tangible, each step purposeful, and at the end of the day, her exhaustion felt cleaner than any sleep she'd known in years. She learned quickly that the cowboy wasn't much of a talker. His words were rationed, sparse, like gold dust too valuable to waste. But when he did speak, she found herself holding on to them. He had a way of saying just enough, no more, no less. "Don't forget the south gate, cows'll wander if you leave it open. That horse'll test you, don't let her see you're scared. Soup's on the stove if you're hungry." They were ordinary words, but laced with a care he didn't name. At first, she thought he had taken her in out of pity. She knew what she looked like that first day, hollow eyes, brittle spirit, the kind of desperation no one wanted near the door. But he never treated her as fragile. He handed her work, real work, the same as anyone else, and expected her to pull her weight. There was dignity in that, and she clung to it. She was clumsy the first week, fumbling with tack, spilling feed, blistering her hands on ropes. He watched in silence, only stepping in when it was clear she might hurt herself. When he corrected her, it wasn't sharp, just firm. "You're pulling too hard, horses ain't machines." Gentle, but sure. Or, "You're holding the pitchfork wrong. Here, like this." His hands guided hers once, rough calluses against her skin, and she remembered the way her breath caught, not from nerves but from something she couldn't name yet. By the second week, she had calluses of her own. She learned the names of the cattle, could recognize the quirks of each horse, and even started humming under her breath while she worked. The cowboy noticed, though he never said. But sometimes, in the evenings when they shared the quiet over bowls of stew, she caught him watching her with a softness that made her chest ache. One night, a storm rolled in fierce and sudden, the kind that rattled the windows and sent the cattle restless. He was already pulling on his coat when he found her at the door, boots laced, determination written across her face. "You don't have to," he said, voice gruff but not unkind. "I want to," she answered simply. The rain drenched them in minutes, cold needles against their skin as they worked side by side to herd the animals back into the barn. Thunder cracked, spooking a young heifer, and she nearly slipped in the mud chasing after it. His hand caught her elbow just in time, steadying her. Their eyes met in the flash of lightning, hers wide, his steady, and something passed between them, wordless, undeniable. He let go quickly, turning back to the task, but she felt the warmth of his touch long after the storm passed. That night, soaked to the bone and bone-tired, they sat by the fire in silence. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, until he tossed her a blanket without looking up. She smiled faintly at the gesture, tucking herself beneath its weight. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Days blurred into weeks, and little by little, she began to open up. She told him fragments of her story, not all at once, but in small confessions that slipped out between jaws. How she'd left a place where she was never seen, never valued. How she'd been running more from emptiness than from danger. How she had nothing left but the will to keep breathing. He listened, never interrupting, never pressing for more. When she faltered, he gave her silence instead of pity. She was grateful for that. His presence was steady, like the land itself, harsh at times, but grounding. In return, she learned about him in fragments too. He had grown up on that ranch, raised by a father who'd taught him the ways of cattle and land, and a mother who had passed too soon. He carried the place on his shoulders now, alone, with only the hired hands who came and went with the seasons. It was a lonely life, though he never admitted it. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered on the horizon, in the way he sat quiet at the dinner table, as though used to silence being his only company. One evening, while repairing a broken fence together, she asked, "Don't you ever get tired of it? Being out here, all this space, all this quiet?" He paused, hammer in hand, eyes fixed on the sunset. "Quiet don't bother me, loneliness does." His voice was low, almost lost to the wind, but she heard it. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled. Instead, she reached for another board, setting it in place beside his. He glanced at her, and though he didn't smile, there was a shift in his gaze, softer, almost grateful. The days grew shorter, the air sharper with winter's approach. They prepared together, stacking wood, storing feed, patching roofs. It wasn't easy work, but the harder it got, the more she realized she was no longer surviving out of desperation. She was choosing to stay. Each sunrise, each shared task, each small moment between them built something she couldn't ignore. And then came the night of the branding fire, when the truth neither of them had spoken threatened to spill over. The herd had been restless, and one calf slipped through the corral. She chased after it on instinct, but in the chaos, her boot caught a rut, sending her sprawling. Pain shot through her ankle, sharp and immediate. The calf bolted into the dark, but before she could even try to rise, he was there, kneeling beside her, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You're hurt." His tone was sharper than usual, threaded with worry. "I'm fine," she lied, wincing as she tried to stand. His arm slid around her waist before she could protest, lifting her with surprising gentleness. "You're not fine." His jaw was set, his eyes flashing with something she hadn't seen in him before, fear. He half carried her back to the house, ignoring her murmured protests, lowering her carefully onto the worn couch. Kneeling before her, he unlaced her boot and slid it off with care, his rough fingers brushing her skin. She sucked in a breath, not from pain this time, but from the nearness of him, the way his presence filled the room. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world stilled. He didn't speak, but everything he'd been holding back was there in his gaze, the longing, the loneliness, the unspoken plea. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickening, and she knew then what she hadn't wanted to admit. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was home. He exhaled, sitting back slightly, as though pulling himself from the edge of something dangerous. "I told you before, I'd pay double if you'd stay forever," he murmured, almost to himself. Her lips parted, her heart aching with the weight of it, and for the first time, she let herself hope. She wanted to answer him that night, to tell him his words had cut deeper than he knew, but something in his expression stopped her. The cowboy wasn't a man who spilled himself easily. When he did, it was raw, unguarded, a rare glimpse beneath the armor he wore as naturally as his hat and boots. To press then, to rush a truth still forming between them, felt like a betrayal of its own kind. So she held the silence gently, cradling it as though it were more fragile than glass, and only nodded as he eased a blanket over her shoulders. The days that followed carried a strange new weight. Every glance, every brush of his hand, every moment of quiet in the barn or at the table thrummed with an awareness neither of them named. She began to notice the smallest things about him, how he paused a moment longer at the window before heading out to the herd, how he always poured her coffee before his own, how he hummed under his breath when he thought no one was near. The kind of man who rarely spoke wasted nothing when he did, and she found herself listening for his voice the way one waits for rain in a long drought. Winter pressed hard upon the land. Snow came in thick curtains that swallowed the fields whole, and the wind howled across the prairie like some ancient beast. The work did not stop. If anything, it grew harsher. They rose before dawn to break ice in the troughs, to dig paths through drifts so the cattle could be fed. Her hands cracked from the cold, her cheeks raw with windburn, but she never once asked to be spared. He worked beside her, his strength unrelenting, but he watched her more closely now, stepping in when the burden grew heavier than he thought she could carry. One evening, after hours battling the storm, she stumbled into the warmth of the house, her body trembling with exhaustion. He followed close behind, snow clinging to his coat, his jaw tight with concern. Without a word, he guided her to the fire, pulling a chair closer so the flames licked at her frozen boots. Then, with a gentleness that startled her, he knelt and unlaced them, setting them by the hearth to dry. "You'll wear yourself thin," he said, his voice low, roughened by more than the cold. "I can keep up," she answered, though her voice betrayed the tremor of fatigue. "I know you can." His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unwavering. "That doesn't mean you should have to." The space between them was thick with unspoken things. She could feel the warmth of the fire on her skin, but it was his nearness that made her breath falter. She wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid of the work, that she'd rather stand beside him in the storm than anywhere else in comfort. But the words tangled in her chest, too heavy to release. So instead she whispered, "Thank you," and hoped he heard everything she couldn't say in those 2 syllables. When the blizzard finally broke, the world lay buried beneath white silence. The air was sharp, crystalline, and the sky stretched wide and blue above them. They walked the land together, checking fences, counting cattle, their boots crunching through the snow. At one fence post, she paused, her gaze caught on the endless horizon. "It's strange," she said softly. "When I first came here, all this space felt empty. Now it feels endless, like there's finally room to breathe." He studied her, his gloved hands resting against the wood. "That's the thing about this land. It'll swallow you whole if you let it. But if you stand steady, it'll give you back more than you ever thought you lost." She turned to him then, caught by the quiet conviction in his voice, by the way the light caught in his eyes. She wondered how much he had lost, how much he had borne in silence all these years, and how he still found a way to carry on with such steadiness. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt he had insisted she take, she realized she was no longer afraid of the stillness, no longer haunted by the emptiness that had chased her across miles of road. Here, in the vast quiet of the ranch, she felt not hollow but full of work that mattered, of moments that stitched themselves into something resembling belonging, of a presence beside her that steadied her without chains. Yet the more she grew into this life, the more she feared it might not last. The world beyond the ranch had never offered her permanence, only fleeting chances that slipped through her fingers like water. She worried that one day, he might decide she was just another season, useful until she wasn't, and then let her go like the hired hands before her. The thought gnawed at her in the dark hours, though by daylight she buried it beneath determination. Her chance to know the truth came sooner than she expected. It was a bitter morning when one of the cattle broke through the fencing near the creek. They saddled their horses quickly, riding out together to track it down. The snow was deep, the ground treacherous, and when her horse spooked at a patch of ice, she nearly lost her seat. He was beside her in an instant, his hand steadying her rein, his voice calm despite the danger. "You all right?" She nodded, though her heart raced wildly. They pressed on until they found the animal, cornered near the frozen water. Together they worked to drive it back, circling, pressing, until at last it rejoined the herd. The relief that flooded her left her weak with it, but it was the look in his eyes when he turned to her that undid her completely. "You could have been thrown," he said, his voice tight. "Do you know what that would have meant?" "I stayed on," she answered, trying for steadiness. "That's not the point." His hand came to rest against her arm, firm, almost trembling. "I can't," he broke off, jaw clenched, eyes burning with a fire she had only glimpsed before. She swallowed hard, the cold forgotten, the whole world narrowed to the feel of his hand, the weight of his words. "Can't what?" she whispered. "Can't watch you risk yourself like that. Not you." The words struck deep, not with fear but with a fierce, unexpected warmth. She had been unseen for so long, drifting like a ghost through her own life. To matter this much to someone, to have her safety carry such weight, it broke something open inside her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The horses stamped restlessly, the wind cut sharp across the snow, but all she could feel was him, his hand still on her arm, his gaze locked with hers. Then, as if realizing he'd said too much, he pulled back, clearing his throat. "We should get back." But she heard it all the same. And as they rode home through the white silence, her heart carried a new truth. He didn't just want her here for the work. He wanted her here, with him.